Hey, what's going on, everybody? This is Jake from College Football Redzone coming to you guys with a brand new video here today as we just witnessed the college football playoff bracket officially unveiled as of earlier today. And so, with that being said, it's time to really get into the meat of things in terms of trying to finally figure out who is going to go about winning the national championship. Start off with 136 teams, starting from the same spot. We now got it down to 12 teams, and now we get to a point where, hey, there's only 12 teams that are actually sitting here and competing for a national title. So, very excited to jump into it here in this one, as we do have the ESPN bracket challenge pulled up. So, let's go ahead. We're going to pull it up. Let's get our bracket pulled out. So, with that being said, let's go ahead and jump right into it. And guys, if you enjoyed this video, make sure you go ahead, do a couple of things for me. Make sure you hit that like button as well as hit that subscribe button as well if you do happen to be brand new to the channel. And let's go ahead and get into it, starting from our top, from the very top, and going to be working from the way down. I think that's how I want to go about doing things. Now, some games I'll talk about more than others. You'll kind of get the picture as we get through it, right? So we'll get things started here. First game that we have is James Madison traveling to Eugene, Oregon to take on the Oregon Ducks, who end up being your number 5 seed in this college football playoff this year. Now, first and foremost, shout out to James Madison. The fact that they did make the college football playoff, I thought, this was a team that definitely deserved some love this year. And the one loss that James Madison had was to a Louisville team, a decent Louisville football team that was in the hunt for the ACC title. And at the same time, that was also a time period where James Madison, they were looking to figure out their quarterback situation. They have since rectified that. This is one of the better defenses in the G5 with an offense that is very capable of being explosive, multiple 50 bombs over the course of the regular season. So I actually think that James Madison is probably the best equipped G5 team to get into the college football playoff and win a first round game, hypothetically. The problem is that I don't love the matchup for James Madison, unfortunately. Now, if they were taking on like an Alabama or an Oklahoma or even an Ole Miss team that does not have their head coach, not going to have the majority of their offensive staff, maybe, it's be a more interesting conversation from that perspective. The thing is, it's not. Oregon is rolling right now. Their only loss of the year is to the number 1 team in this bracket, in the Indiana Hoosiers. So I ultimately think Oregon is going to be too much. They are going to move past James Madison. I do think that's the 20.5 point spread that's currently reported on FanDuel. I think that's a little bit rich. I am leaning towards James Madison at least covering, but I do think Oregon is going to be too much to handle offensively. And I think it's going to be one of those games where it might be tight and a little tighter than expected in the first half, and then Oregon pulls away in the second half, wins relatively comfortably, so expecting like a 14 to 17 point win. Next game that we have, Alabama and Oklahoma. Now, these two teams, we actually did see these two teams meet in the regular season, oddly enough, right? Alabama did go and play against Oklahoma in the regular season. Oklahoma wins that game against Alabama, which you want to talk about games that created some implications for the rest of the college football playoff. Think about imagining if Alabama wins that game against Oklahoma, right? We're talking about Oklahoma, first and foremost, not making the playoff in the first place, but we're also talking about Alabama hosting a playoff game, possibly being in that conversation to getting a top 4 seed, even with a loss in the SEC championship game, even though we do have one of the more horrific losses to a Florida State team that's not going to a bowl game, or at least not because they met initial bowl eligibility. But Oklahoma wins that game, and what that also does is effectively kicks out BYU, right? Because if it wasn't for that, then BYU, they would have been in the top 10. BYU would be in this playoff. So it's one of those games that's actually quite consequential. Now, in terms of the game itself, both these teams kind of profile in a similar way offensively. offensively, neither of these teams can run the football. These are two teams that are going to make their damage primarily through the air, whether it's Oklahoma with John Mateer. Hopefully, John Mateer continues to look. Maybe we get the first half of the season, John Mateer, not the second half of the year, John Mateer. And then Ty Simpson, who is going to be bound to be a first round NFL quarterback. At the same time, because he doesn't have that run game, it really shows how limited the Alabama offense can be with how one-dimensional they are. What I will say, and I'm going to lean towards Oklahoma for this particular matchup for two particular reasons. I think this is going to be one of the this is going to be the most competitive first round game that we have. One, this game is happening in Norman, Oklahoma, and because Oklahoma won the regular season matchup, and I think that might have been in Tuscaloosa. I'm not 100% sure there, but because this game is happening in Norman, definitely weighing towards that home field advantage. That home field advantage is absolutely incredible to have, especially for a playoff game environment. Norman is going to be rocking. And then at the same time as well, another reason why I'm going with Oklahoma, I trust their defense a little bit more. I think their defense is a little bit more stout than Alabama's, where Alabama's is a little bit more of that bend but don't break kind of style. So I am going to go ahead and roll with Oklahoma to move on to play Indiana in the Rose Bowl. Now in the bottom half, one of the games I think is going to be one of the lesser competitive games. I think it's going to be the least competitive game is Ole Miss and Tulane. Yes, Ole Miss did absolutely lose their head coach and did lose the majority of their offensive staff, which is a cause for concern. And Tulane is peaking at the right time. Shout out to Tulane Green Wave winning the American, the toughest conference in the G5. The thing is, we did see this regular season matchup already happen. Ole Miss absolutely crushed Tulane earlier in the season. And it's just one of those things where I'm just not sure if Tulane has improved enough to where not only can they make this an actual competitive game, but at the same time, are we looking at it from a spectrum of can Tulane win this game outright? And I have a little bit more faith in James Madison beating Oregon than I do Tulane beating Ole Miss. And you talked about how I guess skeptical I am of James Madison being able to beat Oregon. So we're gonna go ahead and roll with Ole Miss beating Tulane, moving on to the Sugar Bowl where they'll take on the Georgia Bulldogs, which leaves us to our last first round matchup that we have, the Miami Hurricanes taking on Texas A&M. So this is a spot right here where I actually think if there's going to be an upset that happens in the first round, I think this is the game where we do end up seeing it happening. For Texas A&M, if you're really thinking about what Texas A&M has done in the month of November, and I don't want to take away from the Longhorns by any means, they've had a phenomenal season under Mike Elko, year number two under Mike Elko. Texas A&M has really started to show some flaws in the month of November, not just from their loss that they've had to Texas in the regular season finale, which ultimately kept Texas A&M out of the SEC championship, cost them a first round bye, but also, thinking back to the South Carolina game where they needed to make a ferocious comeback just to beat South Carolina. And South Carolina had an incredibly down year, an incredibly disappointing year themselves. Looking at Miami on the other hand, yes, they have a couple of head scratching losses, whether it's losing to Louisville at home or losing to SMU on the road. Miami, at the same time, though, this is a team that's playing its best ball at the right time here in the month of November, particularly when they were able to blow out Pitt in a ranked matchup and just simply also handling business in the month of November as well. Just really playing their best ball at the right time. One of the more controversial things was that Miami and Notre Dame conundrum, and we'll talk about what needs to happen in terms of how can we fix the college football calendar and fixing college football in general. But in the meantime, I think Miami is a very physical football team. They have the athletes to match up with Texas A&M, and people forget. And a third thing that I do want to talk about, Miami does have a quarterback that is experienced with playoff action. Carson Beck led Georgia to a national championship way back in, I believe it was 2022. So Miami, this is a guy that does have championship experience. So I'm going to actually go to Miami Hurricanes here, pulling off the upset and beating Texas A&M in the We Beat Notre Dame playoff matchup. So with that being said, we got our first round set. It's mostly chalk up to this point, with the exception of Miami. I think we do have a 10 over 7. It would be the first round matchup that we see in history of the 12 team playoff because last year it was pretty chalk. But now we move on to the quarterfinals, and we start at the very top once again with Oregon taking on Texas Tech. Now, this is one of the more fascinating games that I find here was listen, Texas Tech, they have dominated literally everybody that's been on their schedule, with the exception of the one loss that they had against Arizona State. But that was a game in which Texas Tech, they did not have their starting quarterback. And even then, Sam Levitt needed to lead a game-winning drive in the last 2 minutes of that ball game just to beat Texas Tech in at home, by the way. Texas Tech was on the road for that game. Other than that, Texas Tech has dominated everybody else on their schedule, and that includes three separate instances where they took on teams that ultimately were ranked in the top 15, whether it's BYU on two separate occasions, and the Utah Utes, who, by their own right, have a very compelling argument to be a part of this 12-team field. I think Utah, if they made it in this field, Utah could have done a lot of damage here. They really could, but it didn't happen that way. So, Orange Bowl here between Oregon and Texas Tech. Last year, we didn't see a single top four seed make it to the semifinals. And I think we start to see that break here in this matchup that we do have between Texas Tech and Oregon. So I'm going to roll with Texas Tech here. They've just been so dominant. They've been so stout defensively. If they can figure out how to score consistently in the red zone, turn those into touchdowns instead of field goals, it could be a rough time for the Oregon Ducks, to be honest with you. So I'm rolling with Texas Tech there. Now, for Oklahoma and Indiana, I touched on this earlier. Oklahoma is very limited offensively. Especially if you can shut down that passing game, Oklahoma has not shown that they can run the ball with any level of consistency. While Indiana, on the other hand, they met the freeze point in the Big Ten championship game, and they went on the road and beat Oregon earlier this year. They went into Eugene and beat the Oregon Ducks in Eugene. So, Indiana, they are a battle-tested team. And while they are undefeated, this is a team that did face adversity a couple of times, whether it is the Penn State game or whether it is that Big Ten championship game that really felt like it was a back and forth, very tightly contested defensive affair. I think it's going to be a little bit more of a low scoring game. Oklahoma, I do think is a very good defense, but I don't think Oklahoma is going to be able to score enough to win this game. I think Indiana's going to be able to get a couple of touchdowns at the very least, and I think that's going to be enough for Indiana to move on and beat the Oklahoma Sooners. So, a little bit chalky so far. And that now takes us to Ole Miss and Georgia. So, we see this play out in the regular season. This was actually a very closely contested game. I think this happened in Sanford Stadium, if I'm not mistaken. But Georgia did end up winning that game against Ole Miss. It was a very tightly contested game. And what I always say is that it is always really difficult to beat a really good football team twice. So I'm actually very tempted to take Ole Miss here after Georgia. The problem is that Ole Miss, because of those concerns that I have about their coaching staff, we don't know what this offense is going to look like now that Lane Kiffin and a good chunk of his offensive staff is no longer around. So I look at this Ole Miss Georgia game. If Lane Kiffin was still around and this offensive staff was still around, I actually would have taken Ole Miss to win this game. I'm not super high on Georgia. I know Georgia's been playing some really good football in the month of November lately. But because of those coaching staff concerns, I am going to go with Georgia here, taking down Ole Miss in the rematch. Again, really difficult to beat a really good football team twice. But in this instance, I am going to roll with the Georgia Bulldogs. But the last game that we have is the Goodyear Cotton Bowl between the Miami Hurricanes and Ohio State, a national championship rematch from way back in the early 2000s, I believe 2001, where Ohio State won on a controversial call. to take on the Miami Hurricanes. I do think that this is the type of time where, Miami's quote unquote Cinderella run does begin to come to an end here. I do think Ohio State is just a little bit too much to handle. And I do also question Mario Cristobal's ability to coach in these big time games as well, right? I think like Ohio State losing that game to Indiana is going to be a wake up call. This is still a defending national champion, so even though Ohio State got a little bloodied and bled a little bit, I don't trust Miami's defense enough. And Ohio State, obviously, even in the loss to Indiana, one of the best defenses in the entire country. I think Ohio State can stuff Miami in a locker in this one. So I'm going with Ohio State winning the final first round game. So getting a little bit more chalk here. We've got the top four seeds here in the CFP semifinals. So that first semifinal game, it's the Peach Bowl, Texas Tech in Indiana. That is going to be first semifinal game, January 9th, 7:30 Eastern. So, how do I think it's going to go down? I've talked about how dominant Texas Tech has been. Um, and I think that dominance is real. I really think that Texas Tech, that is a really special football team. And that was evident in how they handled BYU in multiple occasions. And I do think that it's also evident by how um just how good they are in terms of how they dominated literally everyone else. The concern that I have about Indiana is I think Kurt Cignetti is an incredible head coach. That's obvious by how what he's done in Indiana over the past couple of years. But here's the thing: will you get into a point where you're asking yourself to win two or three games in terms of teams against teams that are going to have better talent composites than you are currently going to have? And the working theory is the blue chip theory, right? We have not seen a team that has less than 50% of 4 or 5 star recruits on their roster win a national championship since it was starting to be recorded by 247 Sports back in the mid 2010s. So we've had, like 10 to 15 years of data to work off of. Texas Tech doesn't meet that ratio yet either. But what I will say is that Texas Tech is a little bit closer to that. Indiana will already have one win on its belt. So I say these things because I am a little bit more concerned about Indiana's depth than I am about Texas Tech's depth at this time. So I'm rolling with Texas Tech beating Indiana. Again, I think it's going to be a defensive battle a little bit more. It's going to be a little bit more on the low scoring end. I do think that Joey McGuire and Baron Morton think they do enough to win the Peach Bowl and get that first slot into the national championship game. Other game that we have on the other side here is the Fiesta Bowl between Ohio State and Georgia. Now, obviously, both of these two teams are extremely well coached. We're talking about Kirby Smart, who has multiple national championships under its belt. Ohio State, an extremely well coached team with NFL experience as well, whether you're talking about Ryan Day, who currently has a national championship on under his resume. And you're also talking about a defensive coordinator in Matt Patricia, who obviously has that NFL experience and is a very good defensive mind as well. The difference I think here is that I do think that while I think both of these teams are well coached, I do think Ohio State is a little bit more of a talented team. And I just don't know if Georgia is going to have the appropriate answers in place in order to go out and shut down this passing attack. Whether it's, Jeremiah Smith on the outside, or it's like Carnell Tate, Brandon Ennis, Max Clare at the tight end position as well. There's a lot of weapons here. And I don't think that Georgia is going to be able to do enough to confuse the freshman quarterback in Julian Sayin. So I'm going with Ohio State here. I think they get that give back against the Georgia Bulldogs. And so your national championship game is going to be Texas Tech and Ohio State. Interestingly enough, you're not going to believe this. Interestingly enough, we, if this game were to happen, hypothetically speaking, The model that I have here on College Football Red Zone would actually favor Texas Tech. They would be a 4 point favorite over Ohio State with how dominant Texas Tech has looked over the duration of the regular season. Now, me on the other hand, I disagree with that assessment for the model, and it's for a couple of different reasons. The first reason is something that I've already talked about earlier in my playoff predictions, talking about how, you're asking a roster that still has less than 50% of former 4 or 5 star recruits, those blue chip guys, to win three, sometimes 4 games against really high caliber of competition. Okay? So, with that said, for Texas Tech at this point, we're talking about a third game against a really talented roster. They would beat Oregon in this instance. They would beat Indiana in this instance as well. And now you get up against Ohio State on a neutral site field. I do think at this point, because I believe in the overall talent at Ohio State more than I do with Texas Tech, on a neutral site field. I trust the championship pedigree of the program, whereas Texas Tech, this kind of position will be a little bit more of an unfamiliar spot. And frankly, in the preseason, to keep it real with you, my preseason prediction was Ohio State to win a national championship. You see where Ohio State is on this bracket, they are here. So I am going to also remain loyal to my preseason predictions, and I'm going to go with Ohio State winning the national championship. I do think this is a little bit more of a, I think it's going to be a little bit more of a high scoring affair. So we're going to say like about somewhere in that neighborhood. Like it might be in the low 50s, high 40s. Both teams have really good defensive units. So we're going to roll with Ohio State here, winning the national championship. And there it is, fellas. Excuse me. We're going to roll with Ohio State as your national champion. But definitely let me know down in the comments section what you guys think. Do you agree with my national championship thing? Who do you think is going to win off? And what is your boldest take on this college football playoff? What is the biggest upset you think that we're going to see in the CFP field this year? Let me know down in the comment section as well. In the meantime, this is Jake of College Football Red Zone signing off. Hoping you guys are all out there having a good night. Take care, everybody.